welcome to our deep dive today.
Yeah.
You've given us some really thought-provoking sources
Absolutely, yeah.
that explore the emergence of Islam and its impact on human life, especially in terms of the conflicts and loss of life connected to its spread.
Yeah.
Now, this is definitely complex and sensitive territory.
For sure.
And we're committed to just presenting what's in the data.
100%.
No opinions or anything like that.
Absolutely. A clear-eyed look at the historical context is key here.
Okay, so one source really blew my mind right off the bat.
Oh, yeah.
It said the world population back in the year 1 CE was only 600 million.
Wow.
That's less than India today.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think about how those early events would have felt on such a smaller global stage.
It's a fantastic point, you know? That smaller population size really drives home the magnitude of the changes and losses we're about to discuss.
All right, so let's start with those early Islamic conquests. What I'm seeing is the 7th and 8th centuries were a period of incredibly rapid expansion for the Islamic caliphates, right?
Yeah.
We're talking huge chunks of territory across the Middle East, North Africa, Persia. It's mind-boggling how quickly they spread.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that while this expansion undeniably spread Islamic culture and governance, it also had a significant human cost.
Right.
The sources we're looking at link something like 10 to 20 million deaths to the warfare and social upheaval that came with these conquests.
Oh, wow, 10 to 20 million.
Yeah.
Okay, to put that into perspective, imagine the entire population of California just gone.
Right.
It's really hard to wrap your head around that kind of loss.
Absolutely. It's staggering. But that's just the beginning of the story.
Oh, no.
As Islamic rule grew, the sources also point to further losses related to how non-Muslim populations were treated.
So are we talking about things like religious persecution and forced conversions? I'm thinking of those historical accounts you shared with me.
You're exactly right.
Okay.
Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and other groups, they all face pressure to convert to Islam.
Yeah.
Now, the sources show this varied by region. Sometimes they were allowed to practice their own religions, but had to pay a special tax called the jizya.
I've heard of that.
It was basically a tax for the privilege of practicing a non-Islamic faith.
Right.
This essentially created a two-tiered system within society.
Oh, wow.
Impacting everything from social mobility to economic opportunities for these communities.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Almost a pay-to-pray system.
Right.
But in other areas, it sounds like things were much harsher.
Unfortunately, you're right. In some regions, the pressure was much more intense, leading to forced conversions and violence.
Right.
Over the centuries, sources estimate an additional 10 to 15 million deaths connected to this religious intolerance.
That's truly heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the lasting effects this kind of persecution has. Not just the immediate loss, but the way it ripples through generations, shaping societies even today.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
The trauma, the disruption of cultures, the loss of religious diversity, these aren't just historical footnotes.
Right.
They're forces that still shape many societies today.
Yeah.
Sometimes in ways we don't even realize.
You know, the sources also mentioned resistance movements, conflicts in those areas bordering Islamic rule. It makes me think of places like the Byzantine Empire or even Hindu kingdoms in India pushing back against this expanding power.
Exactly. Those border regions were constantly simmering with tension and conflict. Our sources attribute another 5 to 10 million deaths to these resistance movements.
It's like an early version of the geopolitical conflicts we see playing out today, isn't it?
Yeah.
Different groups vying for power, and sadly, so many lives lost in the process.
It's a striking parallel, isn't it?
Yeah.
The human cost of resistance, whether it's in the 8th century or the 21st, is a stark reminder of the toll conflict takes.
Okay, so we've covered that initial wave of Islamic expansion and some of the immediate consequences.
Right.
But I'm guessing there's more to the story.
Oh, absolutely. The sources take us further down the timeline into the era of those later Islamic empires.
Okay.
Names you've probably heard of, like the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals.
Oh, yeah. Those empires really left their mark on the map.
For sure.
And on history as we know it.
Right.
Conquering Constantinople, campaigns in India, it's all pretty epic stuff.
Right. And what's important to remember is that while we often study these empires for their achievements, their expansion continued to involve significant conflict.
Yeah.
I mean, the sources are estimating another 15 to 30 million deaths just during this period of later Islamic expansion.
Wait, 15 to 30 million?
Yeah.
That's huge. It really puts a different spin on those history lessons, doesn't it?
It does.
It makes you wonder how much of what we consider world history is actually built on this foundation of expansion and, sadly, loss of life.
It's a powerful question,
Yeah.
One that forces us to re-examine those grand narratives we often take for granted.
One area that really jumps out from the sources is this conflict between Hindus and Muslims in India.
Yeah.
They paint it as this incredibly devastating chapter in terms of human life lost.
It's definitely a complex and tragic period.
Yeah.
The sources detail a long history of invasions, massacres, and forced conversions under different Islamic rulers in India.
Right.
And the estimated death toll is truly staggering, between 60 and 80 million.
Wait, 60 to 80 million?
Yeah.
That's almost impossible to imagine. That's more people than the entire population of the UK today.
It's a horrific illustration of the sheer destructive power that these kinds of religious and political conflicts can have.
Right.
And remember, most of those who died were civilians caught in the crossfire, not soldiers.
It's a stark reminder that behind these massive numbers are individual lives, families, entire communities ripped apart by violence.
Right.
The human cost is simply immeasurable.
It really is.
Yeah.
And what's perhaps most disheartening is that this cost continues to echo in India and beyond, shaping social, political, and religious dynamics even today.
We've been talking about the conflicts between Islam and other religions, but the sources also mention significant violence within Islam itself.
Right.
Between Sunni and Shia Muslims.
You're right. This sectarian divide has been a persistent source of conflict throughout Islamic history.
Yeah.
And at times even more intense than conflicts with other religions.
Right. It stems from that early disagreement over who should succeed the Prophet Muhammad, leading to the Sunni and Shia branches of Islam.
Exactly. It boils down to a fundamental difference in interpretation.
Okay.
Sunni Muslims believing the leadership should have passed to one of Muhammad's close companions.
Right.
While Shia Muslims believe it should have gone to his cousin and son-in-law, Ali.
Wow, such a seemingly simple difference led to centuries of conflict and bloodshed.
It did.
From the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE all the way to modern-day conflicts in places like Iraq, Syria, and Yemen.
And the sources estimate that millions have died as a result.
Yeah.
It's a tragic example of how religious differences, especially when intertwined with power struggles, can have devastating and long-lasting consequences.
So, looking at the big picture here, we have all these different sources of conflict tied to the rise of Islam conquests, religious persecution, those border wars, and then the internal strife between Sunnis and Shias.
Yeah.
It feels overwhelming just trying to grasp it all.
It is a lot to take in, and if we look at the aggregate estimate from the sources, it paints a sobering picture.
Yeah.
They suggest that over a period of about 1,400 years, somewhere between 110 and 170 million people lost their lives due to these conflicts and persecutions connected to the emergence and expansion of Islam.
110 to 170 million. Wow, that's almost double the population of Germany today.
It's a truly staggering figure.
Yeah.
That underscores the profound and lasting impact of these conflicts on the course of human history.
It's clear that religious intolerance played a huge role in all of this, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The sources consistently emphasize how religious motivations, often mixed with political ambitions, fueled these conflicts and amplified their human cost.
Yeah.
Forced conversions, persecution of minorities, battles over holy sites.
Yeah.
It all contributed to that immense loss of life.
And it's interesting how the impact varied so much by region.
Right.
We've already touched on India as a particularly tragic example.
Yes, India really stands out. It saw the largest share of these losses.
Right.
A grim testament to the intensity of those Hindu-Muslim conflicts that raged there for centuries.
So if we step back from all these numbers and details, what are the key takeaways you'd want our listener to focus on? What's the so what of all this?
It's a great question, and I think the most important takeaway is to recognize the sheer scale of human tragedy that's woven into these historical events.
Right.
Millions upon millions of lives lost, and we're still grappling with the consequences of that loss today.
It's a sobering reminder of just how destructive things can get when religious and political ambitions get tangled up, isn't it?
Absolutely. And while we focused on the emergence of Islam in this deep dive,
Yeah.
it's important to remember that similar levels of death and suffering have occurred during other major religious or imperial expansions throughout history.
Right.
It's a pattern of human behavior we need to understand, to learn from, if we ever hope to create a more peaceful future.
Right. It's about seeing those patterns and learning from them.
Absolutely.
All right. So we've laid out this really broad overview of the human cost associated with the emergence of Islam.
Yeah.
But I think it's time to zoom in a little
Okay.
and look at some specific examples of how these conflicts played out and what kind of impact they had on the people who lived through them.
Sounds good. You know, it's really important to remember that those large-scale conflicts we discussed earlier weren't just abstract events. They were made up of countless individual stories, stories of struggle, survival, and loss.
You're so right. It's easy to get lost in those massive numbers when we're talking about millions of deaths.
Right.
But behind each one
Yeah.
is a person, a family,
Right.
a whole community whose lives were forever changed by these events.
Exactly. And to really grasp that human cost,
Okay.
it's helpful to zoom in on some specific examples.
Yeah, let's do that.
The source material you provided delves into some really interesting theological differences that fuel these conflicts.
Oh, interesting.
For instance, it talks about the origins of the Quran and its relationship to earlier scriptures like the Torah, Psalms, and Gospels.
Okay, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
It basically gets into how those different religious texts contributed to tensions. Right.
Precisely. The source explains that from the Islamic perspective, the Quran is seen as the final, unaltered revelation from God.
Right.
Whereas earlier scriptures like the Torah and the Gospels are believed to have been corrupted over time.
So it's almost like Islam views the Quran as a correction, a way to restore those original monotheistic teachings.
Exactly. And this belief had a significant impact on how Muslims viewed and interacted with people of other faiths. It created a sense of having the true faith,
Right.
which could then be used to justify actions against those who didn't share that belief.
I see.
Yeah.
It's almost like a theological justification for conflict, a dangerous dynamic when you think about it.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
That sense of divine mandate can be a powerful motivator.
Yeah.
And the sources point to specific instances where this played out in those early Islamic conquests.
Okay.
One example that stands out is the treatment of non-Muslim populations in Persia,
Right.
which is modern-day Iran.
Oh, right. Persia.
Yeah.
I remember from the sources that it was a major center of Zoroastrianism, a religion that predates both Christianity and Islam.
Exactly. And when Islamic armies conquered Persia in the 7th century,
Okay.
the Zoroastrians faced intense pressure to convert.
Yeah.
Temples were destroyed, many were killed,
Oh, wow.
and the religion was basically driven underground.
Right.
It's a powerful example of how religious and political ambitions intersected,
Yeah.
leading to the near eradication of an entire belief system.
It's hard to even imagine an entire religion being almost wiped out like that. It
Yeah.
really speaks to the brutality and the intensity of those early conquests.
It does. And you see this pattern repeating throughout history, unfortunately.
Right.
When empires expand, often fueled by a belief in their own superiority,
Yeah.
the conquered populations often bear the brunt of the suffering.
That's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
And speaking of patterns,
Yeah.
the sources also mentioned the Byzantine Empire, which was predominantly Christian.
As another flashpoint. Right.
Yes, the Byzantine Empire was a major power in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah.
And its clashes with the expanding Islamic caliphates lasted for centuries.
Right.
One of the most notable and brutal conflicts was the siege of Constantinople in 718 CE.
Ah, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a legendary city known for its wealth and strategic location.
Yeah.
Taking that city would have been a major prize for any conquering force.
Exactly, and the Islamic forces were determined to take it.
Yeah.
They laid siege to the city for almost an entire year.
Oh, wow.
But the Byzantines managed to hold out,
Okay.
thanks in part to a harsh winter.
Oh, really?
And this new weapon they had called Greek fire.
Greek fire. What's that?
Imagine a sort of ancient napalm,
Okay.
a flammable liquid that they could project onto enemy ships.
Right.
It was incredibly effective, and it played a key role in repelling the Islamic siege.
Wow. So they held them off.
They did.
But even though the Byzantines won,
Yeah?
the cost was immense.
It was...
The sources didn't mention specific numbers, did they?
No, but it's safe to assume thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands, died on both sides during that siege alone.
Wow.
And that was just one episode in a long and bloody conflict between these two civilizations.
Wow, it's a stark reminder that even when an invasion or a siege is unsuccessful, the human cost can still be absolutely devastating.
You're right, it's a crucial point.
Yeah.
Warfare, even on a seemingly small scale,
Right.
leaves lasting scars on individuals, families, and entire societies.
Now, we've talked about Persia and the Byzantine Empire,
Right.
but from what I'm seeing in the sources, India was the region that suffered the most in terms of lives lost due to these conflicts.
It was.
Why was India such a focal point for this kind of violence?
That's a great question. India was, of course, a vast and wealthy land,
Yeah.
making it a prime target for any empire looking to expand. But it was also a land of incredible diversity, a melting pot of religions and cultures, many of which were very different from Islam.
So essentially you have this clash of civilizations, of different belief systems and ways of life, which naturally leads to friction and conflict.
Exactly. And this tension boiled over into a series of invasions and conquests.
Right.
Starting as early as the 11th century with Mahmud of Ghazni.
Mahmud of Ghazni.
Yeah.
I vaguely remember that name from history class.
Yeah.
Wasn't he known for being pretty ruthless?
He was. He led raids into northwestern India from his base in Afghanistan.
Okay.
And he's often portrayed as this brutal figure who destroyed temples and plundered vast riches.
Oh, wow.
He's a controversial figure to this day.
Right.
But there's no doubt his raids had a devastating impact on the people of India.
It sounds like he paved the way for even more conflict.
Unfortunately, yes. His raids weakened resistance in the region and essentially laid the groundwork for later invasions and conquest by Islamic dynasties like the Delhi Sultanate.
The Delhi Sultanate.
Yeah.
Remind me, what was their significance again?
The Delhi Sultanate was a powerful Islamic dynasty that ruled over major parts of India for over 300 years.
Oh, wow.
Starting in the 13th century.
Okay.
That's a long time for these kinds of conflicts to be raging.
Yeah.
And during their reign, there were countless battles, massacres, and forced conversions.
Right.
All contributing to that staggering death toll we discussed earlier.
Right. That 60 to 80 million figure.
Yeah.
It's hard to even comprehend that scale of loss.
It is.
It's a reminder that we're not just talking about numbers here.
Right.
We're talking about real people.
Yeah.
Individuals with families and communities whose lives were cut short by these conflicts.
Exactly. And one particularly poignant example from the sources is the destruction of the Vijayanagara Empire in southern India in the 16th century.
The Vijayanagara Empire?
Yeah.
I don't recall learning about that one.
Oh, really?
What was their story?
They were a Hindu empire that had resisted Islamic expansion for centuries. But in 1565, a coalition of Islamic sultanates defeated them at the Battle of Talikota.
Right.
It was a brutal battle. And the Vijayanagara capital was completely sacked and destroyed.
Wow. That sounds like a major turning point.
It was. The Vijayanagara Empire never truly recovered.
Yeah.
And the sources describe the aftermath as a period of immense chaos and suffering.
Right.
It's a heartbreaking example of how a single battle can have these ripple effects that last for generations.
It really drives home that point you made earlier.
Yeah.
That the human cost of these conflicts is immeasurable.
Yeah.
And the scars they leave on societies take centuries to heal.
Absolutely. And while we've been focusing on those conflicts between Islam and other religions, we shouldn't forget the significant violence that occurred within Islam itself, the conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims.
Right, you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah.
Even though it's an internal conflict, it seems like it was just as intense,
It was.
if not more so than the conflicts with other religions.
That's correct. The Sunni-Shia divide has been a constant source of conflict throughout Islamic history.
Right.
And it all boils down to that fundamental disagreement over who was the rightful successor to the Prophet Muhammad.
Right. The Sunnis believing it should have been one of Muhammad's close companions, while the Shiites believed it should have been his cousin and son-in-law, Ali.
Exactly. And this seemingly minor difference in interpretation has resulted in centuries of conflict and bloodshed.
Right.
The Battle of Karbala in 680 CE, where Ali's son, Hussein, was killed, is a particularly significant event for Shia Muslims.
Right.
And the memory of that tragedy continues to fuel tensions even today.
It's almost unbelievable that something so seemingly straightforward could lead to so much violence and division, isn't it?
It really is. And unfortunately, that historical grievance continues to fuel conflicts in the modern world as well.
Right.
We see this playing out in places like Iraq, Syria, and Yemen,
Yeah.
where different factions are vying for power and influence.
Yeah. It's a stark reminder of how easily religious differences can be exploited for political gain, and how often innocent civilians end up paying the price.
You're absolutely right. It's a tragic pattern that repeats itself throughout history,
Yeah.
and it highlights the critical importance of promoting tolerance, understanding, and peaceful coexistence between different religious groups.
Right.
It's something we need to be constantly working towards.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive, looking at specific examples of conflict and the devastating human cost.
Yeah.
From Persia to the Byzantine Empire to India, it's been a pretty intense journey.
It has.
What would you say is the most crucial takeaway for our listener to consider?
It's a great question. I think the main takeaway is this.
Okay.
These large-scale historical events, like the emergence and expansion of Islam, aren't just abstract concepts.
Right.
They're made up of countless individual stories of loss, struggle, and resilience. It's about remembering that behind the statistics, behind the grand narratives, are real people whose lives were profoundly affected by these events.
Absolutely.
And by understanding those individual stories, by truly grasping the human cost of conflict, perhaps we can gain a deeper appreciation for the importance of peace, tolerance, and understanding in our own time.
I couldn't agree more. It's about humanizing history.
Yeah.
Understanding those ripple effects that continue to shape our world today.
Exactly. And with that in mind, I'm curious to explore those long-term impacts to see how these conflicts shape the world we live in today.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to pick up in our next part.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we've really dug into the human cost of the emergence of Islam.
Yeah.
Looking at specific conflicts and how they impacted people and societies. It's heavy stuff.
It is.
But now I'm really curious about the long-term consequences. How did all of this shape the world we live in today? It's hard to imagine such massive shifts in history not still having some effect on us.
You're right to be curious. The ripples from those historical events are still felt today.
Right.
And in some really profound ways. One of the clearest legacies is the demographic and cultural landscape of huge regions of the world. I mean, the spread of Islam fundamentally changed the populations and cultures of the areas it touched.
Makes sense. Right. Think about the Middle East, North Africa, even parts of Asia.
Right.
Those regions were completely transformed by the emergence of Islam.
Right.
It's kind of hard to separate them from how we think about those areas today.
Absolutely. And it wasn't always a smooth or peaceful process. Those sources you shared highlight the lasting impact of religious intolerance, especially towards non-Muslim groups.
Right.
It's something that still has consequences centuries later.
We've already talked about the persecution of Zoroastrians in Persia. And that pressure on Christians and Jews to convert that was happening in many regions. It's disturbing to think those patterns of intolerance still echo in some parts of the world today.
It's true, and it underscores that the wounds of history can take a long time to heal. Building real tolerance and understanding between different religious groups, that's a challenge we're still wrestling with.
It feels like a lesson we haven't fully learned yet.
Yeah.
And one that's important for everyone, not just those specific regions.
You hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah.
It's a global challenge and essential if we want a more peaceful and inclusive world.
Right.
But it goes beyond just those demographic and religious shifts, you know?
Yeah.
These conflicts also reshaped political and economic systems in a huge way.
Oh, right. Like how empires rose and fell.
Yeah.
Borders moved, new trade routes opened up.
Right.
It all ties back to those conflicts we discussed.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see those connections a lot more clearly now.
Exactly. The sources mention the Ottoman Empire as a prime example. They ruled a vast territory for centuries, controlling vital trade routes between Europe and Asia.
Right.
Their impact went far beyond their own borders, changing the whole geopolitical landscape of the region.
It makes sense, right? The legacy of the Ottoman Empire is still visible in places like Turkey, the Balkans, and the Middle East. You can see it in the borders, the languages, even the cultural traditions of those regions.
You've got it. It's a perfect example of how history isn't just something in a textbook.
Right.
It's a living force that continues to shape our world.
Yeah.
And understanding those historical forces can make the complexities of today's world a little easier to navigate.
You know, for me, one of the biggest takeaways from all this has been the sheer scale of the human cost. Millions upon millions of lives lost over centuries of conflict.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to wrap your head around the magnitude of that loss. It makes you wonder, what can we even learn from something so tragic?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
What can we learn? How can we avoid repeating those mistakes? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of it all.
Right.
But I think there's some important lessons here.
Yeah.
One that really stands out for me is the danger of religious intolerance. When one group believes they have the absolute truth and the right to force it on others, it creates the perfect conditions for conflict and violence.
That's so true. Tolerance, respecting other belief systems, being willing to have real dialogue and understanding.
Yeah.
Those are crucial for a peaceful and just society.
Right.
And it's not just about tolerance between different religions either. It's about respecting every individual, no matter what they believe, where they come from, or their background.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
We need to recognize the inherent value of every single human being. That means treating each other with respect and compassion, even when we disagree. It's easy to say.
Right.
But putting it into practice, that's the real challenge.
And something else that stuck with me is how dangerous it is when political ambition gets mixed with religious fervor.
Yeah.
Over and over again, we saw how leaders used religious justifications to pursue their own agendas, and it often ended up costing countless lives.
Right.
It makes you think about who we're putting in charge and what kind of world we're creating.
It's a vital point. The combination of religion and politics can be incredibly toxic.
Yeah.
Having clear separations between those spheres of influence is essential
Right.
to make sure that religious beliefs aren't just being used as tools for political gain. It's about accountability, transparency, and ethical conduct, no matter what your beliefs are.
It makes you realize that we need to hold our leaders accountable, regardless of their religious or political background.
Yeah.
They're serving the people, not the other way around.
Exactly. We need to demand more from our leaders.
Yeah.
Transparency, ethical behavior, a genuine commitment to peace and justice.
Yeah.
Those should be the non-negotiables.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the human cost of the emergence of Islam, I'm left with a lot to think about.
Yeah, me too.
It's been a journey of sorrow, acknowledging the immense loss of life and the suffering that went on for centuries. But there's also a sense of hope that by studying history, by learning from those mistakes, we can maybe build a better future for ourselves and for those who come after us.
Absolutely.
It's not always easy, but it's definitely worth it.
I feel the same way. History can be a harsh teacher,
It can.
but it's also full of wisdom. If we're willing to listen to its lessons, if we really try to embody those values of tolerance, respect, and compassion, maybe we can break those cycles of violence.
Yeah.
Maybe we can build a world where peace and justice actually win out.
Well said. And to you listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I hope it's made you think, helped you understand a bit more, and maybe even inspired you to keep exploring history and how it connects to us today.
Yeah.
It's not always easy, but it's definitely worth it.